1 Corinthians 7 and 8. Well, Roman marriages were often arranged and involved very little personal choice between the spouses, at least among the wealthy. Marriage was often thought as a way to move material wealth from one generation to another in this world. And the success or failure of marriage was how well a couple could show a good social standing to their outside world. It didn't really involve the personal happiness, especially of the wife. So for reasons like these, it's often difficult to directly apply 1 Corinthians 7, a chapter devoted to marital relationships, directly to our situation today. And our reading goes in many directions. Marital rights of the spouse, how to handle widowhood, separation, divorce, being married to a non-Christian, those considering engagement, and then even remarriage. So it's easy to think that Paul's advice or Paul's teaching goes in a lot of different directions, or has that he has a lot of main themes, such as 7:15, God has called us to peace. 7:19, keeping the commandments of God is what matters. 7:26, this is good because of the present distress. Again, it shows there's a very occasional issue that's prompting Paul's teachings. 7:32, but I want you to be without care. 7:35, this I say for your own profit, not that I may be putting a leash on you, but for what is proper, and that you may serve the Lord without distraction. So what I'd recommend, even in reading through those different passages within 1 Corinthians 7, is that there's one main theme coming out of Paul's teaching on marriage. And it comes from, again, think of how our converts in Corinth, mostly Gentiles, had never associated morality and even the happiness of a marriage to their worship of a deity. In this case, yes, we need to, Paul says, because God is actually, as opposed to the Roman gods and the created gods that they worship, God, our God, is actually out for our happiness. He wants us to be happy, and you saw that, or you heard that in several things I read there. The godly person has the benefit of having a God who is always on the lookout for their ultimate benefit. God, in a sense, is looking out for us, not the other way around, and the pagan never would have thought of that. So Paul is saying, I believe, in this chapter, welcome to a relationship between human and God that is healthy and even enjoyable. What we want you to do, Corinthian believers, is apply that same practice between husbands and wives. You're out for your mutual joy, your mutual happiness. That's the ultimate goal of a marriage. In fact, I like that line, God has called us to peace, shalom. This should be what marks a Christian marriage in Paul's mind. Another important point to consider here in 1 Corinthians 7, and this is elsewhere also in Paul's teachings, is the difference between what I would call advice of Paul, or personal views of Paul, and the other side, which would be sometimes how we think of the Bible as a divine how-to guidebook, that it's either right or wrong, and the Bible tells us how to do the right and avoid the wrong, and that everything can be divided between a right decision and a morally wrong decision. I don't think that's the way the Bible presents our life. Most of our decisions are in the gray. The book of Proverbs is largely saying we have right and we have wrong, and then we have this huge thing in the middle called wisdom. And so I'd recommend that we hear Paul in that light. And in that sense, re-listen to some of the phrases Paul uses in chapter 7. Verse 6, but I say this as a concession, not as a commandment. Verse 12, but to the rest I, not the Lord, say this. 7:25, now concerning virgins I have no commandment from the Lord, yet I give judgment as one whom the Lord in his mercy has made trustworthy. 7:40, but she is happier if she remains as she is, according to my judgment. And I think I also have the Spirit of God, his way of saying I wasn't born again yesterday. I've been around, and I know, I have advice for how to be happy. And he's not speaking, again, as an apostolic delegate saying this is what you must do on many occasions here. I think chapter 7 is trying to say, here's what I would do. I would thus take these biblical rules on divorce that some people would see out of verses 12 to 16, for example, and kind of back off and realize we're not talking rules here. We're saying, or we're hearing Paul saying, this is what I would do. I'm not forcing you to do it, but if you want to be happy, here's what I'd recommend you do. So in a word, I don't think 1 Corinthians 7 is to be looked at as a set of rules for Christian marriage and divorce and remarriage. Well, the same applies for chapter 8. Chapter 7 is setting up again where Paul goes with chapter 8, a chapter which has this difficult discussion of food being offered to idols, whether on sacrifices or in temples. And this issue ends at the end of chapter 8, the last verse. Here is what I would do, though you do not need to make my choice, your choice, but you need to decide. So let's take a look at this. This is the scene. Let's set the scene for how chapter 8 works. Again, it's very different from what we're used to today. First of all, there were pagan temples that dedicated sacrifices to gods. They were making covenants with created deities in these temples. 2, there were private dinner parties where much the same thing was going on, where a home, a villa, would have a dinner party, and the food that was being served was being dedicated to a god or goddess, and they would pray. This is where we get the idea of saying grace over a meal. They would pray and dedicate the food to the god before they ate it there in the home. Thirdly, then, there are believers in Jesus who, looking at that situation, know that food is an inanimate object. As she holds that piece of bread, she knows that the bread, the food, is able to be separated from the moral discussion, the moral decision about whether we're serving or worshiping a deity or not. This is just food. This is a moral decision about which God to worship, and this person, in this illustration, this woman knows that food can be eaten as a separate issue without the God being associated with it. But, number 4, there are other Christians who would look at this and confuse the whole story that we've told, Numbers 1 through 3. If they see food dedicated to a god, if they see her coming out of the temple with this food, they would assume that the person eating the food is worshiping the god. And that's where Paul is seeing a problem. I was in where I had a missionary come through church back when I was pastoring, and they showed slides of a Brazilian seaside or a seashore, and they're talking about their ministry on the beach, as it were. And I said, "What's that pile of food right there?" And there was a good sized pile of fruits and vegetables and such, and this was a very poor area where people were going without food. And he said, well, that's something you'll see in Brazil quite commonly on the seashore, where people will dedicate food to a god and leave it there. No one will touch it. Even if they're starving, people will not touch that food because they associate the food with the god to whom it is dedicated. So in effect, there were 2 lifestyles being lived out in Corinth. One would be a person who would go into Apollo's temple, eat the meat, separating the food from the worship of Apollo in their mind. Another person would stand outside Apollo's temple and be aghast that this believer in Jesus would go in and eat meat sacrificed or dedicated to Apollo. So what Paul is doing in 1 Corinthians 8, and again it ends with, well, let's read the verse. But when you thus sin against the brethren and wound their weak conscience, you sin against Christ. Therefore, if food makes my brother stumble, I will never again eat meat, lest I make my brother stumble. It's Paul almost making this little, here's what I would do. Not that you have to do what I'm doing, but I value the Christian enough that if a person is bothered by what I do with the meat that I am eating, then I will never eat meat again. He's taking the story of Acts 15, in essence, and putting it in now to 1 Corinthians 8.